Your claim that there is a contradiction is based on a misunderstanding of Genesis chapter 2, verse 19.
All right, let's see it.
In Genesis chapter 1, it's clear that the animals are created before Adam and Eve on the 5th day and then the 6th day. In Genesis 2, Adam is created, and it reads, "Out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam." Comparing other Bible translations, you'll notice that the NIV and the ESV make it clear that God had formed them from the ground, and this is the time that he brought them before Adam. Multiple scholars agree that the verb can be translated in the pluperfect tense. If one explanation can be provided to where both chapters can be true, then it's not a contradiction.
So I've got a number of concerns with this rhetoric. To begin, I've never been particularly impressed with the apologetic retreat to this notion that two texts do not contradict each other unless there is no possible way for them to be harmonized, because that basically opens the door to any amount of speculation and ginning up of scenarios that are not in evidence in order to wind one's way around all of the data to try to connect the dots of two different texts. And that standard basically buries the bar underground and renders it so it's pretty much impossible for two texts to contradict, because you can always just imagine ways to get around contradictions in texts. And this also doesn't fit reality, because somebody can write a text to intentionally contradict another text, and we can generate scenarios that are not in evidence to harmonize the two texts. And so one would have to say, well, these texts do not contradict, even if the second text was explicitly written in order to contradict the first. But those are intentions, and those are data that we cannot have access to. And so the best that we can do is weigh probabilities. That's really all we're doing here. And so I think a more honest and definitely a more critical and data-driven approach would be to say that it's possible that these two texts do not contradict. To suggest that until you can prove it's impossible to harmonize them, they cannot be said to contradict, I think is pretty pedestrian rhetorical prophylaxis for univocality. And this brings us to the actual argument, the notion that there are scholars out there who argue that the Wayik Tol verb form can carry a pluperfect or a past perfect sense. Now, this is not how Biblical Hebrew usually communicates the pluperfect or the past perfect. Usually you have to interrupt the past time narrative sequence, which uses a series of Wayik Tol verbs, and you interrupt it with a katal form. And that indicates there's some kind of anteriority here that is giving some kind of background or something like that, or is resuming some information that was provided earlier. That is how you communicate the pluperfect. And if we look in perhaps the most authoritative biblical Hebrew grammar of the last century, João Mouraoka's Grammar of Biblical Hebrew, they point out that this is how Hebrew does it, and there's not another way to do it. Now, they acknowledge in the footnotes that there are scholars who argue that there are other ways to do it, but they also point to scholars who criticize that. There are scholars who think Wayik Tol can communicate a pluperfect or a past perfect sense, but they are overwhelmingly in the minority, and I don't know of any who actually argue for a pluperfect sense for the Wayik Tol who are not explicitly trying to defend a pluperfect interpretation of the Wayik Tol verb at the beginning of Genesis 2:19. In other words, the whole argument is born of dogmatism. The whole argument is constructed on the foundation of refusing to accept the plain reading of Genesis 2:19 because it would contradict Genesis 1, and that is unacceptable. This is not following the data where they lead. This is beginning from a dogmatic conclusion and then arguing that the data do not stop you from getting there. And what that indicates is that what the text actually says is not the priority. If what the text actually says were the priority, you would seek out the most likely reading. But the authority is the dogma, it's the tradition. It's what the Bible is or is not allowed to say. That's the authority. The text is secondary. The text is just there as the proof text. So what it says is not important. Defending the dogmas is what's important, which is why apologists have to constantly retreat to this line of, as long as I can gin up the tiniest little sliver of not impossible, I win. Because the rhetorical goals of apologetics overwhelmingly are about the audience who already agrees with the apologist and is just searching for the tiniest little scrap of not impossible so that they can feel validated in their agreement, so that they can be made to feel like they're not wrong in believing these dogmas. And so the argument is not there to engage directly with critical scholarship. The argument is not there to try to determine the most likely reading of the text. The argument is there to help people who already agree feel validated in their agreement with a dogma. So that is not scholarship. That is putting the dogma firmly ahead of the data. And the fit for this video has been Mal Smith's band Hold Fast, Die Slow.